Welcome to Musical Talk. This week I'm joined by Jennifer Reichel. It's very nice to meet you, Jennifer, in person.
I know, first time to see you.
Yes, exactly. It's the first time. We've only just met in real life, and instantly I said, well, let's record a podcast then. So we're going to talk today mainly about my favourite musical theatre composer and lyricist, who's called William Finn. For those of you not familiar with him, he's currently got a show on at the New Players Theatre down in Charing Cross, near Embankment. And it's called Make Me a Song, and it's a selection of a lot of the songs that he's done from many of his musicals. And it is indeed a song cycle, and it includes...
Okay, we've got A New Brain, In Trousers, which was William Finn's first ever show, as far as I know. America Kicks Up Its Heels, The Falsetto Land. We've got Elegies, which is apart from Spelling Bee, probably the most popular one. The 25th Annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. It was on Broadway for how long? Do you know?
It's just very recently closed. I think it closed January 20th this year, and I think it would have opened around 2005. So that's not bad going. Two and a half years. And as you say, In Trousers was kind of the first thing that he was known for. That was the first thing that went to Playwrights Horizons in New York, about which a little bit more later. He'd written, I think, 3 or 4 musicals before that when he was at Williams College, which of course is also where Sondheim went. Although Sondheim is said to believe that the resemblance between the men's there, which is very interesting. So what do you know so far of William Finn stuff before you'd seen Make Me a Song?
I knew of the shows, most of them, and I sort of knew some of the songs, but I'd never actually seen a William Finn show, so I figured it would probably be a good start for me to go and see a review of all his songs and just see what they, how they perform. Because all I'd heard was just a demo CD or a recording on Amazon or iTunes or something. So I didn't actually know that much about him. Whereas
I go as a bit of an aficionado because I've got the recordings of In Trousers and March of the Falsettos and Falsetto Land. I'm not total completist. I do have A New Brain and Elegies. I don't think I have Infinite Joy, which is another song cycle they did of his stuff. I'm a big fan, and I'm a big Finn fan, because he seems to portray a very particular kind of sensibility, and the sensibility is very... there's a strong sense of irony and cleverness behind, a lot of his songs, but there's also a very strong sense of... There's an old-fashioned, slightly Broadway-ish feel to a lot of the way that he writes as well, but he constantly ironizes it, and he constantly makes it a little bit more... He undercuts it with unsentimental stuff.
There's the cynicism, isn't there? There's always that cynicism present, but then he'll suddenly do a vulnerable ballad, and you'll think, oh my God, this is so different to the cynical quartet we've just heard,
No, exactly. And so he has... So you'll move from something like 4 Jews in a Room Bitching, which is the opening number of March of the Falsettos, into something like Unlikely Lovers, which where the main character of all 3 musicals, In Trousers, March of the Falsettos and Falsetto Land, who's called Marvin, he has a lover who's called Whizzer, and Whizzer dies of AIDS in the 3rd musical. It's a very heartbreaking song, during which Marvin is being quite maudlin, and Whizzer is kind of saying, well, hang on a minute, I'm not dead yet, and stuff like that. So there's always this kind of irony going on. What else are you familiar with of his?
Well, I knew Stupid Things I Won't Do, which is one of my favourite Finn songs, and it was performed brilliantly by Frances Raphael.
I must admit, I don't know where that's from originally. Do you know what it's from?
That's from the Royal Family of Broadway, which is still work in progress, isn't it?
Yes, it's not...
I don't know anything else about it.
No, no, I don't know anything else about it either. And in fact, I did try to get Bill, as you'll hear in the interview later, to talk about future projects, and I don't think he likes doing that because he always seems to refuse requests to talk about them. But the Royal Family of Broadway, so is that, presumably that's already a bit of a popular cabaret standard, is it?
Not at all. I mean, I've never heard it being done, which is why I thought, oh, brilliant, this is something to keep in the back of my rep and pull out when it's needed, one of those things.
It's a very showy, it's a very Broadway insiders number as well, isn't it, in terms of... I mean, the implication is that she's kind of putting out all the way through the song, in effect, but the song is all about how she won't do certain things, and the implication is that actually, clearly she would.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it's kind of the opposite of, say, Paris Makes Me Horny from Victoria, which is, like, really obvious. I'm talking about it and putting it out.
Exactly. It promises and it delivers. So we have quite a wide selection of shows. Let's just talk a little bit in more depth. Let's talk about Spelling Bee for a bit, because we've talked about Spelling Bee on the podcast before. One of the things that's very good, I think, about Spelling Bee is that he takes characters that it would be very easy to mock, and he enriches their characters and gives you some background. Again, as he'll say in the interview later, he sort of saw it was originally an improvised comedy thing in, I believe, in New York called Crepuscule, but spelt out CREP, etc. He saw the video, they took a video, and then he got together with Rachel Schenkin, who he'd taught, I think, on the New York University, the Tisch School of the Arts musical theatre course, and they turned it into a musical, and he added this layer of sympathy into it. Do you have a particular song that you like most from it?
I really enjoyed I'm Not That Smart. That's probably my favourite song. Because I think it was the balance between comedy and vulnerability. And I think when Finn does that, he sort of gets it spot on. That's his main thing that I think he's really, really good at. And that song shows it off.
He's been asked, actually, in the past who he identifies most with out of the kids in the Spelling Bee. And Leif Conybeare, who sings that song, is the one that he tends to identify. And you wonder why, really, because he clearly is pretty smart, but there's a certain sort of shambling chaoticness to the whole persona that you get through some of the musicals.
Well, he says that at the beginning, doesn't he? When there's that whole at the beginning of Make Me a Song, they have a whole a group number where they say, thank you to my neighbours for letting me compose and being so supportive, even though what I was writing was crap. So there's always that sort of, I'm not that smart, I'm not that great, but thank you anyway.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, there's a lot of gratitude. He did get lucky in some ways. I mean, he did In Trousers, which he kind of staged as a reading in his apartment, and then it so happened that Andre Bishop from Playwrights Horizons, who later developed Assassins and Sunday in the Park, came along to see it, and he kind of got discovered that way, and he got put together with James Lapine, of course, also well known from Into the Woods and other things, and suddenly got somebody who was going to really organise his total chaos into something that had a shape. And that was a very pleasing thing about it. But it's interesting that he's kind of moved on from that, and the Spelling Bee musical offers a book by somebody else entirely that, he's... I
think Spelling Bee is probably the most commercial show of his. I mean, a lot of people can relate to it, whether you're a teenager and somebody who's a speller at your school, or whether you're in a Spelling Bee yourself, or you're a parent who's a smart kid, or whatever. So I think it's the show that most people can probably relate to. So the most... publicly popular show. That's probably why it's done well.
It's interesting that it has done well. I'm just trying to think of other songs that come from it, because we talked about I'm Not That Smart. I'm just trying to think of this other sort of repertoire that we could recommend listeners if they haven't. Well, they probably are familiar with it, but if they haven't heard it.
My Friend the Dictionary is the other one, which people tend to pick. I haven't actually heard that many Spelling Bee songs around the audition circuit. I think it's because they're quite specific. You can't sing it for, say, Les Mis or Wicked. It doesn't quite work.
Well, you could if you were doing Gavroche or something like that, maybe. But yeah, it wouldn't play so well. I'm very fond of the I Love You song, which comes quite close to the end. It's a trio, and it's for the girl who sings My Friend the Dictionary, Olive Ostrovsky, I think the name is, and she recalls her distant father who isn't present at the Spelling Bee because he's late, because he just doesn't really care about her very much, and her mother who's in an ashram in India, as the original song says.
Yes, I remember this now.
And so she gets the word chimerical to spell, and suddenly she goes off into a fantasy where she imagines her mother and her father both being present, and both of them telling her over and over and over again in this really gorgeous arrangement that they love her. And it's a very, very moving song, and it's kind of one of the big... And I suppose it's a shame in a way that it's a trio, because that probably would be a big audition song if it weren't. Let's think. We could talk about A New Brain a little bit. Do you know any of that? Or
yes, I know I'd Rather Be Sailing, because that was one of those songs that sort of, again, hit the audition circuit when I left drama school. Everybody was singing it, So I got a bit sick of it, really.
Is it a bit passé now?
No, I think it's a good, but again, it's a difficult audition song. What do you sing it for? What show would you go and sing I'd Rather Be Sailing? It's quite specific.
Yeah, that's true. I suppose you need a sort of more relaxed part, basically, that you'd be auditioning for. I think also, is it for a baritone? I think it might be.
Yes, it's a baritone, yes. And in the show they pair it with Set Sail, or You Set Sail, or whatever it's called, from In Trousers, which I thought was a very good idea.
It gives it a very new dramatic context. It's one of the interesting things about this show is that they do reset. There's a falsettos sort of section of it where they try and sort of summarise that show in a way without trying to tell the story, because you can't get it from that.
I found that a tad confusing. I mean, I'd read the thing and I was like, okay, right, this is what they're trying to do. But I thought if you hadn't read that, I don't think you would have known what was going on.
Well, what's fascinating is that I listened to the albums of March of the Falsettos and Falsetto Land, and I still didn't know what was going on. So I listened to them about 6 or 7 times because there's just so much specific action and it's so fast. A lot of the detail, like the psychiatrist scene and so on. That seems to be another sort of thing that people identify about Finn. They tend to kind of, the way people do, they hear fast lyrics, they tend to go, oh, well, that's like Sondheim, isn't it? And he does have that sort of stereotype, that sort of reputation. So we know, I'd Rather Be Sailing from A New Brain. New Brain's a great, we've talked about it at greater length in the show before, so I'll refer you back to that episode if you want to check that out. But it's a very organised musical compared to some of the earlier stuff, but it came from, again, an autobiographical sort of experience. Okay, what else can we talk about? We've talked about
Elegies. Elegies, which was, again, another thing that was very popular in auditions, because it's emotions, isn't it? It's a show about basically people dying of AIDS and their relatives and friends and how they deal with it and basically how they deal with it.
Yeah. And it's not a show with a plot, it's kind of like a song cycle.
Again, yeah, it's another song cycle, isn't it?
This popular form, the song cycle. And in many ways it kind of it recollects a lot of the people in Finn's life who have died for one reason or another. What are the big numbers you would say that tend to get done from that?
The main song is the big one that Louise Dearman sings at the end, called Anytime I'll Be There, that's it. Which I actually think is a very good audition song, and I've never actually done an audition, so...
The story behind it is that it's a friend of his that he and his partner were godfathers to her daughter, and she, the character who's singing it, was someone they knew who died of cancer midway through her life, really, while her daughter was still very young. And so the song depicts her saying, anytime you're on the baseball field, I'll be there. Anytime I'll be just tucked around the corner, I'll be there somewhere beside you.
I thought that was good. I thought it was a tad long. Yes. But I did like it.
It was written for her funeral, so she gave them... So I think we have to give them a pass on that, because they... although we could review the funeral... But I think she asked him. They said, please write a song that will just make everybody at the funeral cry, because that's what you have to do at a funeral in order to move on. So
the other song I really, really liked from that, which I didn't know at all, was Only One. Which Sally Ann Triplett did, and I thought she did that brilliantly. It's a teacher who is sort of effectively played as a spinster, who doesn't seem to have anything in life that matters apart from knowledge and finding other young children that she can pass this knowledge on to, and that they sort of represent her, and she sort of lives her life through these genius or very intelligent kids she finds, and that's all that matters. And of course, throughout the song you realise it's not all that matters, as always is with these songs, but that's the song anyway.
It's a lovely song, and I do a bit of teaching myself, I identify with the sentiment very much. I only need one. If I can pass on that one thing I'm passionate about, then that's all you ever need. We're going to cut across now to an interview I did with William Finn after the night before. He may have sounded a bit stressed here, because this was the night before they actually did the press night. But I managed to corner him for 20 minutes and to ask him as many questions as I possibly could about his career. And I'm afraid I gushed a little bit and told him that he was my hero.
Yeah, it's sweet that I'm your hero. Go ahead.
One of the reasons for that is just because of the personality of the material that you write. And what's fascinating is that you began writing musicals, and the first topic, or the topic that you came up with for the show that got you into Playwrights Horizons, was a Jewish man who divorces his wife, moves in with a gay lover, and then eventually in the next show gets them all to move into one family. What was the reason for thinking that this was the musical that you wanted to write?
Oh, I had no idea. It started within Trousers, where I had the character of Marvin, and Marvin had Giddy seizures, and I didn't know what Giddy seizures were, but I just thought, I have a character, and then he found Wizard Brown in one song. Wizard was giving him a blowjob, and I had the character of Marvin, and I had his wife, and then I also had Miss Goldberg and his high school sweetheart, characters that I found I couldn't use in the next show. But I knew that Marvin's life was one that interested me, even though it did not resemble my life. And Lapine suggested, when James Lapine was added to the mix as director and eventually co-writer of the book, he suggested that we add a boy I said, Marvin's son? He said, I don't care. Just, I work well with children. I mean, I'm sure he had the whole thing figured out. But adding Jason to the whole mix, and then Mendel and Whizzer gave, I don't come up with a lot of ideas. So the only reason I used what I had is because I felt I already knew a little about their personalities, so I wouldn't have to reinvent them, because I'm not so good at reinventing. So it was totally because I had these characters available, and I just started. It was also a time when there was a whole kind of gay revolution going on. I don't know that I felt a part of it, but I decided to lead it in my own little world. So that's what happened. It fell into my lap, and I couldn't believe that I was writing. I remember as I was writing the song "Whizzer Going Down," which is about Whizzer giving Marvin a blowjob. I was sweating on my bed. I thought I had 104 temperature, and I thought this is the end of a career that had never begun. But only by writing things that nobody else had written, and writing about a world that really hadn't been written about, unless it had been written about but campily, and that's what I tried not to do. I did not want to write another campy version of gay man. I wanted to write about a gay world I knew and understood. So I had never seen it in a musical, and La Cage aux Folles had already come out, but that was again something I had no idea about, even though I found the show kind of moving. Structurally, it's very moving, and there's some great songs, as always in Jerry Herman shows. But it's just a whole different world. It's a different world from mine completely. And I didn't know what I was writing, but all I knew is I would read Frank O'Hara occasionally. Whenever I would start writing, I'd read Walt Whitman, and I would try and get those rhythms into my head and the slanginess of both their languages, even though Whitman's like 1850 or whatever. So I was trying to invent a world that, well, I really didn't know, but I at least felt a part of. So that's how the Marvin shows started.
There's a very strong voice to them. There's a sort of a cleverness aligned with something to do with being a bit sentimental, but at the same time not being very sentimental. And
and you can't perform my songs sentimentally, and that's when I'm embarrassed with performers. That's always the trap they fall into. When they perform them sentimentally, I just want to die, and it's because I write in a very fervid kind of way, and you just have to play it as coolly as you can. Doesn't mean boring, doesn't mean stiff, but there has to be a toughness to what you're doing, and you just can't disappear in sentiment.
That said, there are also very gorgeous floating melodies and stuff. So how would you describe your relationship with sentimentality as a writer? I mean, is it something that you kind of have a lot of ambivalence about?
I have no ambivalence about it. I write, and this is what I tell my students at NYU, but I ask them to write from a place where everything that's funny is serious, and everything that's serious is funny. And so I want first you to laugh, and then if you're moved to tears, that's fine. I'm not embarrassed about it at all. I find it very easy to write something that moves people to tears. On the other hand, I don't write that much. I try to write that much, but I don't put out that. My output isn't that large. So I'm very careful about the sorts of things I do, and they all seem to have similar shapes where you laugh in the first half and cry in the second. My relationship with sentimentality is just that after you've laughed a long time, you may want to cry. I think that's fine. I want you to be moved. I want you to laugh and then be moved. And but it can't be done if you perform it sentimentally. It won't happen.
The original staging you did of In Trousers, which I think was in your flat, in your apartment in New York.
Well,
is that right?
we in my apartment in New York, we borrowed chairs from the Temple across the street and put. They were enormous events. People were hanging out of the kitchen trying to get into them. They were real events, and I don't know, we did it like 4 weekends or something, or 4 Mondays, and every Monday it got bigger and bigger and later, and they just were extravaganza, and they all started at 11 o'clock at night because people were working and everything, and we just had a ball. Alison Fraser and Mary Testa, and my friend Kay Pesic from Williams, friend, and
Ira Weitzman, of course.
Ira Weitzman eventually came to see the show because Andre had. I used to do shows in my apartment, and Andre had seen one that was actually, we did at 3 a.m. because there was a producer coming up from Washington, and my mother she started cooking for everyone. She came in from Boston to see the show, but she said, so she made omelets for everyone, and they were there till 3 a.m. And Andre saw that evening, the evening where the producer never showed up, and. It was like waiting for Guffman, my own waiting for Guffman, and that's where Andre saw it. And so when we sent him the thing about In Trousers, he sent Ira Weitzman down, and Playwrights Horizons wanted to do for composers and lyricists what it had done for playwrights, and so he just did that.
Yep. And they got you together with James Lapine in the first place on March of the Falsettos first, I think.
Yes, James was a good friend of Andre's. And he was doing table settings then. And I went and saw table settings and said, I love the way he's directing. He directs like a musical. This is directed like a musical. And it was clear as day that we could get together. And Andre shoved us together. And Lapine says I pestered him. Now, I don't remember that at all, but it could have been. But I think I was a little nervous about pestering him, so I'm not sure I did. But he was a cool potato in those days, which he is not at all now. He's turned into a sentimental old fool, but he's just a great guy. And
what was it that he brought along to that mixture? Because obviously you were you talk about the certain randomness
he has a very, very, very logical mind, and he understands structure innately in a way I don't, except for Spelling Bee, when I understood how to make that show work. But it's not that difficult. Lapine can take different sections of a song, throw them together, and make a new song in a way, not with music, obviously, but with meaning. And and it was for someone like me who can write the music and everything, but get stuck with the action. This was an ideal relationship.
What do you think might have happened if you hadn't chanced on him at Playwrights Horizons?
Oh, I'd be a loser. I wouldn't.
That's very honest.
I wouldn't have had a successful. I don't think I would have had a successful show.
Development is obviously something you've got into at the moment. I want to talk about that in a second, if I may. But I'm very interested to know the development of your work as it went through the next sort of few shows. Obviously, you had a Broadway show with falsettos and won a Tony, and then a little later, I think via Tish, you get together to do the Spelling Bee musical. When did you sort of feel that you had developed as a writer of musical theatre?
Well, I think far and away my best piece is Elegies. And every song I wrote in that, I was writing way above my talent. I don't know how it happened. It'll never happen again. But every day I would sit down to write, and I was writing way better than I should have been writing. And I know it sounds stupid because it lasted over 6 months, but I was in a place where I'll never be again, where I just was. It was pure talent coming out of me. It was the best I had, and it was so much better than I expected to have that. I used to knock myself out every day, and even now I feel that every song in that is just as good as I can write. The only song that I wrote not to be a part of Elegies, which was really the first song I wrote for Elegies, was a friend of mine, Monica Andrus, was dying, and she asked, and I was a godfather to her children, Arthur, Salvador, and I, the guy I've been living with for 28 years, and we're fathers to her children, and she asked if I would write a song to be sung at her funeral that will make people cry. And so I wrote that song, and that's Anytime. And I wrote it and didn't know what to do with it. And then my mother died, and a bunch of friends died, and I just started writing songs about dead people. And I said to Andre after I'd written about 5, Andre, do you have any interest in hearing a song cycle about dead people? He said, oh, sure. So that was the beginning of Elegies, and it was like, I said, in 6 months, well, let's do a reading. And Wendy Washington was sitting next to me, crying hysterically. Arthur, who was sitting apart from us, and I kept on saying to him, because it was really about the last 20 years of our life, the people in our lives, the last 20 years. And I said, Arthur, you really should hear some of these songs. And he said, no, I'll hear it at when you at the presentation. That way I don't have to tell you what I really think, because you that way I'll hear it. I won't get involved with the creation of it, and it'll be fine. And I said fine, but there were some songs that he hadn't expected, and I hadn't told him what anything was about, and they were about some of his former lovers who became our friends, and it was Andre says, I'll do whatever you want, but then he just gave us we did it on off nights of other shows. And then everyone wanted to do that show, and Andre at Lincoln Center said, no, I'm doing the show. But then he never did it. So everyone wanted to do it, give it a real presentation. And Andre said, no, Lincoln Center's doing it. Then they never did it. But that's that.
One of the things that comes up as a sort of a theme in your work is that you write children in a certain way, and that's something that really comes to the fore very strongly in the Spelling Bee musical. Are you... you said that you kind of saw the original improvisations of the Spelling Bee musical and said...
They made a tape of them. They very smartly made a tape of their production and had it wonderfully edited. Rebecca Feldman had done it with a few friends of hers, including Dan Fogler, who played Barfi, the brilliant Dan Fogler, and the exquisitely wonderful Sarah Salzberg, and Jay Reese, who she married, and wrote a lot of the definitions. And they did an improvised sketch, and it was funny. It was meandering. It had no ending. There was nothing. There was no after it had the definitions. It had the first part of the show, but it didn't have any development in the characters. There was nothing. There was nothing that was happening to the characters or anything. We had to provide all that, and we had to then make up 4 of the 6 kids.
It seemed to me that you had an affinity there, where you said there was a kind of in another interview that the Spelling Bee really struck a chord with you. Also, of course, Jason with his geekiness as well in March of the Falsettos and the characters. Is there some kind of reason for that as an affinity?
Well, you keep on using affinity, but I think I don't know. I love smart, funny kids, and if that's what I write, it's because I want to be amused by my characters.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you talked before about having an autobiographical relationship to some of the shows that you write, and I don't know if it's something that you kind of dwell on much in the process.
Elegies is very autobiographical, but I was trying to write something. I was trying to write like confessional poetry. I was trying to write. I was just at the National Gallery today, and I remember that when I started, I wanted to write. I was inspired by Rembrandt. I saw Rembrandt's self-portraits there, a whole show of their self-portraits, and I wanted to write a bunch of portraits that were as revealing as Rembrandt's pictures were revealing of himself, and revealing of me too. I included myself in all these other lives, insinuated myself in other people's lives. Just And Lapine would always tell me, the more specifically you write, the more universal it is. So I just try and write as specifically as possible and hope that other people recognize these people I was writing about and said, oh, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
He obviously gave you a certain amount of structural advice. That's something you've taken now to giving to other writers at New York University and via the course at Tisch. What's that like as an experience in terms of teaching other people?
Well, it's really fun. It's more than anything, it's fun. That I'm so good at it doesn't surprise me at all. I always knew I'd be a decent teacher, and I just love it. It's hard not to love it. And I love. And currently, I'm the head of a new musical program, the artistic head of a new musical program at the Barrington Stage, where Julian Ann Boyd is the artistic director, and where we started Spelling Bee. And at the end, once we had done Spelling Bee, Julie said, I owe you something. What can I do for you? And I said, first of all, you don't owe me anything, but I would love to have my students have a place to put their shows on. I've got some great students. We've got to introduce them to the world. So let's try doing that. So luckily, I'm in a position to not only teach these wonderful students, but then produce their shows and certainly produce their songs. At the end of summer, we do it's the third year this year. It's called Songs by Ridiculously Talented Composers and Lyricists you probably haven't heard of, but should. So a lot of my favorite songs and student songs get in there, and it's great to just be able to introduce them.
Yeah, it's interesting, the development. Do you think the situation is better for development than when you were starting out?
Well, I was so lucky to get into Playwrights Horizons. Without Playwrights Horizons, I wouldn't have. I don't know what. I was a very, very lucky boy. March of the Falsettos. Intros happened when I was 27. March of the Falsettos when I was 29. So I was a very, very lucky boy, and I've had a few valleys in my career, but I've always just kept writing. And now that I'm teaching, it's reinvigorated me in a whole different way. Teaching is fun, and I'm a really good teacher, and the students all improve, much to my amazement. But for me, it's more delight than I could find no more delight than I find in the classroom. Just
talking quickly about those valleys, because there have been, as you say, at times between, for example, March of the Falsettos and when Falsetto Land came along.
Well, I work on shows and get stuck.
Yeah,
and that's what happens.
What do you do?
I write every day.
Right.
It's not that I'm not writing. I'm just getting stuck. I'm writing around. I'm not writing well. I'm not writing specifically. I don't know what I'm writing. I don't know. I've lost my voice in my ear. I can't find it. I musically nothing. I'm trying to build up all these new sorts of chordal progressions and everything, and I'm just not finding anything that's sounding new to me. Or
yeah. So why do you carry on?
I can't. It's the only thing I can do. I mean, I wish I could stop. I mean, the last few years I've stopped a little.
William, thank you very much indeed for telling us about your process and about the development.
You've been lovely.
Thank you. And Make Me a Song is running at the New Players Theatre at the moment. Go see it.
Did you like it?
Yes, I loved it. It's got everything about you in easy to swallow doses as well. So yeah, no, it's a great success, and I'm looking forward to the next project. What's the next project?
Well, it depends.
You don't know yet.
No, I actually know what it is, but we'll see what you sing next. Nothing, probably.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye.
The marvellous William Finn and his Make Me a Song is currently playing at the New Players Theatre, which is in Charing Cross. Underneath the arches, you can occasionally hear a train go by, and that's playing there until the 6th of April. So, are there a couple of other songs we haven't mentioned yet, and we didn't mention in the interview? One from March of the Falsettos, which was What More Can I Say? What more can you say about that, gentlemen?
Well, I think it's possibly his best ballad ever written, or what I call an all-in-one song, which is kind of like a monologue for an actor, except with music. You know, you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. You arrive at some sort of conclusion, and it's 2.5 minutes or something, or 2 minutes, and 3 minutes maybe. And it's one character's journey at that particular moment in time, and I think he just does it really well in this song.
What's fascinating is that there's a lot of songs which actually do surprisingly stand alone out of the repertoire, but that one is particularly. There's some songs you can't extract out of the falsettos musicals because there's just far too much plot in them. But that's one, as you say, that something happens, but it's very universal.
And I thought it was very well done as well. I mean, we haven't actually talked about the performers as such, but I thought they were all they were well picked because they were all different. But then when they had to do the group numbers, they all fitted in well together, which of course is what good musical theatre performers do. But I thought they really sort of supported each other as well. Even when somebody was on, you could see there was people in the background, you know, thinking about what they were saying rather than, okay, I'm just in the background singing along, you know.
It was very staged. It's been directed by Andrew McBean. The cast are Louise Dearman and Francis Ruffell, of course, famous as the original Eponine in Les Mis, Gareth Snooks, Simon Thomas, Sally Ann Triplett, and Ian H. Watkins, recently in Fame, but of course well known as a member previously of the band Steps, but he's certainly not doing a cash-in here. He's gone off and done his training at Royal Academy of Music, and he's now a very fully fledged and very capable musical theatre performer. It was interesting that some of the scenes were very strongly directed, and there was a lot of business in them. For example, in Only One, there was quite a lot of stuff between the teacher character and the pianist. I occasionally thought maybe it was slightly over-directed, and but maybe because I know the songs, I wanted to sort of sit back and just sort of let them wash over me a little bit rather than have them communicated to me over the footlights, maybe. But I don't know. What did you think of that?
I kind of see what I mean. It's kind of a bit of a cabaret thing, isn't it? That was going on there. So I guess it's a personal preference whether you like that sort of thing, interacting with the audience or the pianist, or whether you'd rather just watch something the way a panel would. You know, I guess it just depends on your personal preference.
I guess you can always buy the album if you just want to hear the song, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought Simon Thomas, actually, who I've never seen before, was great. He had such presence, I thought. He really sort of stood out for me because he didn't try, you know, he was there, and then he did that song. It's about a breakup, you know, a girlfriend breaks or boyfriend breaks up with him. And I just thought, he's one of those actors that's got the whole do nothing down to a T, because you can do nothing and it doesn't work, except for some people. Yeah. But he could do that, because he has that sort of presence, I thought, where you sort of are interested in seeing him, as well as the song.
I did recognise him, and I can't think what I recognised him for, but he is shortly appearing once Make Me a Song Close, yes, in Marguerite, which of course opens in April. So he's doing jolly well. He's straight out of that into something else, so that's always a good trick if you can pull it off. So that was Simon Thomas. Sally Ann Triplett doing the sort of she gets all the more mature parts, doesn't she? So in this.
Well, she was sort of thrown in the last minute, wasn't she? She wasn't originally supposed to be in it. So some of the group numbers she's not in, and she sort of appears randomly here and there. But I was kind of surprised just how young she looks as well. She's got a very versatile face, I think. She can do sort of young, old. Because she played that gum-chewing boy, didn't she, at some point, who walks on. And I thought, and then all of a sudden she's a sort of spinster teacher, and I thought, yeah, she's really very versatile.
I've just noticed in the programme of Make Me a Song that there's a long article by Mark Shenton, the theatre critic, about the current state of British musical theatre writing. And he talks about how people such as William Finn went to Playwrights Horizons, and they got developed there and got put together with other people. And not nearly quite so many things and opportunities happen in the UK as happen in New York and in the States. And in some ways the infrastructure of the industry just isn't really set up very well to get new British shows happening. However, it does happen from time to time, and there was a transfer from the Theatre Royal Stratford East. We spoke to Philip Headley quite some time ago, you may remember from episode 26 if you're a long-term listener, and he talked a lot about a show that transferred to the West End which was called The Big Life, based on the experiences of immigrants from the Caribbean on the Empire Windrush. It's also based on Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. Paul Syrett was the book writer and the lyricist, and we spoke to him at the Soho Theatre. So I suppose first of all we just want to know kind of where the project came from and how you came. A lot of people would like to know, how do you get to write musicals that go onto the West End? I suppose everybody wants to know. What was the process?
A long one, a very long one. I've always wanted to write a musical, and getting the courage to actually do it is something else. And when there's the opportunity, really, and the opportunity really came through Philip Pedley, who, as part of their musical theatre development programme at Stratford East at the time, was putting together playwrights and composers. Really, the composers were people who didn't have a track record in theatre. They were quite often pop musicians, people like that. And he asked me if I'd write something for a 15-minute showcase, and I said, I told him I didn't particularly have anything other than an idea for a much bigger piece, which was a musical based on Love's Labour's Lost. And he was interested in the idea, and he put me together with a guy called Paul Joseph, who's primarily a reggae musician. The idea I'd had a very long time ago, when I was actually doing my A-levels, and for this particular show, which was to be a show based on Love's Labour's Lost, about immigrants from the West Indies coming here. I've always had a love of ska music and played in ska and reggae bands myself, so it was something very close to my heart. And yeah, so we got together, we wrote a 10-minute excerpt from the piece, and then the full piece was commissioned, and hey presto, 4.5 years later it went on.
An overnight success in 4 years.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It does. It takes a long time to develop a musical, but it takes a very long time to develop a musical in the subsidised sector because of the risks involved putting it on. Well, maybe that's unfair to say the subsidised sector. I mean, it's the same for everybody who wants to try out a musical. It does take a long time, but I think we went through lots of problems with funding to get the money to put the show on. A theatre like Stratford East, although they have the desire to put on, call it large-scale musicals, it's not really. It's 12 actors and a band of 6, which isn't that big compared to some of the big shows. But for a subsidised theatre, that eats up almost their entire grant for the whole year. And so if they're going to put a show on, they've got to be sure that it's going to work, because even breaking even is a real long shot at the box office.
And when you say work, you mean specifically it's got to get people in. It's got to sell tickets is one of the big things, presumably.
Yeah.
And also it's a reputation thing as well, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to... at Stratford, they want something that showcases what they want and what they do. And to an extent, what Philip wanted to do at Stratford, which I think was laudable, is to invent the contemporary musical. To bring contemporary music together with contemporary playwrights and try to make a play that wasn't, or make a piece of musical theatre that wasn't old-fashioned. And The Big Life really has its roots in a quite old-fashioned type of musical. It goes back to my love of Guys and Dolls and West Side Story, those kinds of musicals. And the music itself is 40, 50 years old in terms of where it comes from. Certainly ska and reggae, the birth of that music in the 40s and 50s in the West Indies, via a long route from Africa and America and all kinds of other places. So it wasn't new music, and certainly in terms of the structure, the architecture, the subject of the piece, it wasn't an absolute new subject. So it took a little bit of convincing. It wasn't like Du Bois, which was another show, once again based on a Shakespeare, but very, very much more contemporary, using DJs. And
this was Du Bois, which was, I think, MC Scholar, and they did it, and Excalibur, I think, which they did slightly previously to The Big Life.
Yeah.
It was based on the Comedy of Errors. In fact, it was based on The Boys from Syracuse, which is the sort of later version of it.
That's
and they
right.
mashed all of that up into a sort of, it was very hip-hop, and it was very more contemporary style. So this was a bit different.
It was. Well, I mean, obviously, once again, they're going back kind of 50 years, I guess, for their source material, and then back another 350 years to Shakespeare for their source material. But that was very much a very deliberate attempt to write a very contemporary, cutting-edge piece, and The Big Life, I just wanted to be a great night out, whilst at the same time having something important to say about migration and people getting on together, really.
So that's quite interesting, isn't it? That there's something that underlies that, because obviously it's very tempting if you're trying to do something which is going to be a popular success to reach for what's going to be popularly entertaining on the surface. Mm-hmm. How did you go about sort of making sure that something underlay that? Now, obviously, you had your source material, but in a way, that's not. The Shakespeare play isn't about immigration, and it doesn't have those messages. So, how does that sort of get integrated?
It just seemed to work really well for me. I don't think Love Saber's Lost, Take Me Out and Shoot Me, if you like, is one of Shakespeare's best plays. In fact, I think it's a little bit boring, actually. And it always seemed to me that it was a great idea for a musical. You know, 4 guys decide to give up women for 3 years so they can better themselves. I mean, where are you going to go with that? It's just really simple, and I felt that would work even better in the context of immigration, where, you know, wave and wave after immigrants into whatever country they might be moving to, they're often the people who work the hardest, who are trying to find their feet, you know, will do any job they can find, especially that first generation, you know, to find their feet in a new country. And so the stakes are even higher for those people. And it seemed to me perfectly believable that a group of people might come to this country and say to themselves, right, I'm just going to focus on earning money and doing as much as I can for myself to better myself in the first few years that I'm here. And so that's what these guys do. And you know, I know a lot of people who I spoke to who came to Britain in the 50s were saying that, you know, they came here for 5 years and they really did try to focus for 5 years, and then you eventually get sucked into the whole thing and you never go back, you know, and you stay, and that's what happens. And I felt that to an extent, I think what producers are often looking for their audiences is a sense of the familiar. And, you know, Love Saber's Lost isn't a well-known play, but there is familiarity in the storyline. And there's also a familiarity in the knowledge of what has happened to generations of immigrants. So that's something that an audience finds comfortable, I think. They can settle into that, like they can go and watch a pantomime or something. Yeah. You know, and not feel too threatened by it.
And although, I mean, you have a principal protagonist in it, but of course he is kind of first among equals, really, because you have a series of different people undergoing the immigration experience in different ways as well. So, I mean, maybe just talk a little about what happens to each of the characters in the story from the immigration point of view.
Sure. Well, interestingly, the main male character in Shakespeare's play isn't the main male character in the musical, and that's just because it felt appropriate in the musical version, or in the musical piece, that the main character is the person who leads the group of men to make their decisions. And basically he's an academic, he's an intellectual who comes to Britain and finds that there is no place for him in an academe here, and has to fight to find his way through the quagmire of menial jobs. There's a guy who works as... He really works in design and architecture, and is thinking about trying to find his way through getting jobs here. Once again, ends up being a postman. The guy who's the academic ends up working in an asbestos factory. One of the guys can't get a job at all, and another one of the guys who's a bit of a lady killer, who's coming over here to make some money and still gives up women, gets a job on the buses. So they're archetypal jobs. And for the women, like a lot of West Indian women, 2 of them are actually in nursing. One of them, the African character, runs a boarding house, and the other character ends up working in a laundry. So they all end up in menial jobs, having come here with very, very high hopes to the motherland, a place that they were taught to respect and told that was a land of opportunity.
You structure that. I mean, that's kind of very explicit in the first song, isn't it? There's an opening number, which I think we're on the SS Empire Windrush. Is that right? Yeah, we're on the actual boat, and the 5 guys have a lot to say about kind of their high aspirations and how things are going to go. And it's actually, I mean, the tone is all the way through. There's a lot of happiness to the tone of a lot of the songs that you've got in there. And of course there's a sort of certain amount of light comedy later on, where the shenanigans are going on between the various couples about they've forsworn meeting women and they're actually going out and secretly doing liaisons, aren't they, and stuff like that. They get caught out, I think, around Eros. So how did you go about sort of structuring where the numbers were going to fall in the show?
It was an entirely organic process. I had the the good fortune to be commissioned to sit down and write this, and what that meant for me was that I could just sit down and write it and put the songs where I wanted, and so I let the songs emerge entirely organically from what I was writing. It's certainly in the early drafts. Then later on we actually sat down and thought, well, actually this exposition is getting a bit stodgy, let's turn it into a song, and it works rather nicely actually. If you can take quite tricky expositional material and you can turn it into a quite funny song, and it suddenly becomes an entertainment as opposed to a labour, and that was fun doing that. So yeah, and we moved, and obviously once you've got the architecture of the piece, you're looking not only at the narrative of the play but the musical architecture as well, and so we did move songs around. A song moved out of the first act into the second act, some songs disappeared, some songs got rewritten, some songs where there was one song in particular towards the end of the second act where we really felt that the energy really dipped, and it was to do with lyrically and musically it was quite laid back, and so we decided to put a much more energised number in there to keep the pace up, literally, to keep the audience feeling energised, and so that was important. And so, as I think with a lot of musicals, it was in the process that we discovered where the songs worked best, how to change the songs, and we had a long time. Like I said, we had 4 years to play around with it. Not that we were meant to; it was meant to be about 1 or 2, but it happens, and so we had a long time to think about it. And we had a couple of showcases at Stratford where we tried to raise a bit of money, and so we heard the songs and we knew what songs weren't working, and so, like I said, it was a journey from that first draft of just thinking I can feel the song coming on, and writing the lyrics, and then later on really thinking quite hard in terms of the craft of the piece, where best to situate a song.
Yeah. Of course, you also introduced a character that you don't usually get in musicals, who has a sort of narration function almost, or a commentary function perhaps, which is Mrs. Aphrodite, which is played by Tamika Empson. How was that character in there from the very beginning, or how did she come about?
No, she wasn't there. Originally we had a cast of 12. Then we worked out that in fact we had 2 characters doing exactly the same thing, or fulfilling a very similar purpose, a very similar type of character, and we thought, okay, we don't need both of these people to do the same thing, so we cut one of the characters. But at this point the show had been budgeted, and so rather than lose the opportunity to employ an actor, we thought, well, what can we do with this extra character? And it was the director's idea, credit to him, Clint Dyer, who directed the piece. He said that, what happens at Stratford East is that the audience is a very lively audience, and quite often they're more than willing to offer their comments to the actors on stage as they're performing, especially at the end of a scene. You leave any gap there and they'll be jumping in and shouting at them. So we thought, well, we'll get our retaliation in first, and it was Clint's idea to have this character of an older West Indian lady who had first come over here at about the same time, but had lived through the last 50 years or so in this country, and in between scenes would comment on what she had seen and her recollections of what had happened then. So Tamika, to her credit, we basically gave her a crib sheet, which was to do with themes and ideas that we were exploring in the scene before and the scene after when she would speak, and every night she improvised around that, and it really engaged the audience. It also gave it a contemporary relevance to see what had happened to that generation of immigrants, and it was bloody funny. She's a very, very funny lady, and it worked not only at Stratford but also in the West End, which was very nice to see.
Just talk about the West End. So, I mean, there were 2 runs, weren't there? I think at Stratford East. Is that right? Yeah. And the last of those was 2004.
2005.
I beg your pardon, 2005. And then you went for a West End transfer. So, what was that process like to get it from Stratford East, which is a sizable theatre, but it's presumably quite another step up to take it to Shaftesbury Avenue?
Mm-hmm. It wasn't that big a leap, to be honest with you, because to play. The musical was written for a proscenium arch theatre. It wasn't like it had to be completely reinvented, and no one was ever going to spend a lot of money, shall we say. And so it was just a case of a bit bigger, a bit bolder, and a bit more money spent on it. And so the design didn't change enormously. It just filled out a bit. The play it wasn't rewritten. A few minor adjustments, but because we'd already had 2 runs at Stratford, it was pretty well settled, and we were going into the West End with the same cast, and so we didn't need to do an awful lot. The bigger questions around the piece were the marketing of the show, and whether a West Indian audience or an audience above and beyond what you might call your usual West End audiences, whether they would come to see the show. And so a lot of attention was given into getting audiences who wouldn't normally come to the West End into the West End.
What sort of thing?
Just by trying to reach community groups like West Indian groups and other groups of immigrants for whom the West End, they would say the West End isn't for them. And on more than one occasion, people came in to see the show in the West End and went to the stage door as opposed to going to the main entrance because they thought that was probably where the show was on. You probably went down some stairs and it was in a little club somewhere. They couldn't quite believe that a show about their experience was on Shaftesbury Avenue and that they could go through the front door to see it. So that spoke volumes about the kind of people who were coming to see the show. But the problem, I think, what happened was that the big focus on selling the show to the black audience meant that the show wasn't sold enough to the white audience, which meant I think that a lot of theatre goers felt that the show probably wasn't for them, whereas I would argue that it was, because it's Shakespeare and it's entertainment at its roots, and it was just one of those things. So whilst it succeeded in what it tried to do, whilst kind of doing one thing, it also shot itself in the foot on the other.
Right, so in a way it was kind of making the leap from, Stratford East does have a specialist audience, which reflects the sort of ethnicity of people around it, and in this case, obviously, there was an attempt to sort of broaden that, or perhaps there wasn't enough attempt, you're kind of saying, that to broaden that in terms of who was going to be advertised to. Okay, it'd be interesting to just find out a little bit about the background to where, before The Big Life got started, really, and where you came from as a writer in order to kind of reach the point where you were doing a musical. Had you done a musical at all before?
I've always written shows with music because I was, and by the skin of my teeth probably still am, a musician. And so my approach to writing drama it comes from a musical perspective, and what that means is I'm quite often writing shows about musicians or using a musical conceit behind the show and using lots of music, lots of other people's music. I always wanted to write a musical, but it's quite hard to convince people that you should be allowed to write a musical. And so The Big Life was my, I think, 5th show for Stratford, and a couple of those previously had used music, but quite often standards, like jazz standards, blues stuff and things like that. And so it was a leap to actually sit down and write an actual bona fide musical, but it's always been in the back of my mind, and it's always been a form that I've particularly liked.
Any particular sort of, you mentioned Guys and Dolls earlier, and is that kind of a big one as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, Guys and Dolls and West Side Story, and I know it's 50 or more years, probably even 60 or something like that, since those musicals were written, but that golden age really of Broadway and those shows, I just think that they're wonderful. I think they're inspirational, and I think they still work today, and they're certainly the shows that inspired me.
Paul Thyrett there talking to us at the Soho Theatre about The Big Life. That's all from Musical Talk this week. You can contact us via our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk. That was a very nice meal that we've just had here in Soho. Jennifer, wonderful to meet you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
No problem.
That's all from Musical Talk this week.
This has been a production of Musical Talk, copyright 2008.